What would you do if the person you loved most stood, silent while his family erased your place in their world? Marbel Ellison believed she was attending a celebration beside her husband, billionaire heir Alden Pierce. She thought she was finally being welcomed into one of Charleston's most powerful families. But behind a half-open door, she overheard a conversation that shattered everything she thought was real. In a single moment, the marriage she had defended, the future she had imagined, and the family she had tried so hard to belong to collapsed around her. What followed was not a story of revenge. It was a story of dignity, resilience, and the extraordinary power of a woman who refused to disappear. Stay with us until the end, because Marbel's journey, from rejection to redemption, will leave you questioning what truly matters most: love, legacy, or self-respect. Sometimes the hardest truth is not shouted in a room, but spoken quietly behind a closed door by the very people who were supposed to feel like home. If you're listening from your kitchen, your car, your room, or anywhere tonight where things feel a little too still, think about where you are and what this story stirs in you. Because Marbel Ellison's story started in that kind of silence. She arrived at the Pierce family estate in Charleston as the sun dropped low, spilling gold across the magnolia trees and the tall white columns of an old southern house. The air carried jasmine, salt, and that quiet weight of money that never feels the need to explain itself. In the back seat of the town car, Marbel smoothed the emerald dress Alden had picked for her. He once told her it made her look like sunrise after a storm, and she had believed him. Tonight was supposed to be the night she proved she truly belonged beside him. Alden Pierce, her husband, a white billionaire, was set to present a $1 heritage fund alongside his parents, Conrad and Vivian Pierce. Marbel had flown in from Seattle, spending nearly $1 just to stand with him, not behind him, not out of sight. With him. The front steps, Alden met her in a black tuxedo, handsome in a distant kind of way. "You look perfect," he said, brushing her elbow. Brushing her elbow. She smiled, but something in his eyes felt shut away, like a door she couldn't open. Inside, the estate shimmered with crystal glasses, oil paintings, silver trays, and quiet judgment. Vivian kissed the air near Marbel's cheek and called her dear like it was a careful warning. Conrad offered a nod meant for guests, not family. Marbel moved through the rooms gracefully, but she noticed everything, every pause, every glance, every invisible line she wasn't meant to cross. 4 room below. Eventually, she went looking for Alden. In the portrait hall, generations of Pierces stared down from heavy gilded frames, but there wasn't a single wedding photo of her and Alden. Not one. At the end of the hall, behind a half-open magnolia-carved door, she heard Vivian's voice. "You still have time to fix this, Alden." Conrad Wall. "You still have time to fix this, Alden." Then Conrad followed, calm and cold. "The board will never accept her as part of the legacy." Marbel stopped breathing. Alden exhaled like a man already tired of choosing. Then came the words that broke everything. "I married her because I had no choice." A violin played somewhere in the distance. Laughter spilled from the ballroom. A waiter passed behind her, unaware that a woman in an emerald dress had just become a stranger in her own marriage. Marbel didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stood there under portraits of a family that had never made room for her. Rule. While the truth settled into her skin, cold and undeniable, a family is stewardship. It is discipline. It is knowing what must be preserved and what cannot be allowed to dilute the future. The senator nodded politely. Vivian lowered her gaze to her plate. Alden's hand tightened slightly around his glass, but he said nothing. Marbel slowly turned her head toward her husband. In anger, not in tears. Just the quiet focus of someone realizing a door had closed for the last time. Alden felt her eyes on him and swallowed, yet still chose silence. That was the moment something inside Marbel stopped waiting to be chosen. 2 years, she had translated his hesitation into love. She told herself he needed time, that families like his changed slowly, that private affection mattered more than public courage. But love hidden behind closed doors was not protection, it was control dressed as care. Tenderness that only existed in private was not love at all. It was arrangement. When dessert plates were being cleared, a young attendant arrived with a silver tray of envelopes for the foundation board. One cream-colored envelope, sealed with the Pierce crest, slipped loose and landed near Marbel's chair. She picked it up before anyone noticed. Her name wasn't on it. Something in the uneven seal, and the way Vivian's eyes immediately shifted across the table, told her this letter had been waiting for her longer than she knew. With a calm excuse, she stepped away and walked down the east corridor toward the powder room. Only when the door closed did she open it. Catting. Inside was a copy of an old letter from Conrad and Vivian to the family attorney, dated 6 weeks before her wedding. The language was precise, legal, and almost polite in its cruelty. They had offered Marbel $2 million to disappear from Alden's life quietly, called her unsuitable for the Pierce name. They warned that Alden's inheritance and voting control would be reconsidered if the marriage went forward. She read it once, then again. Her hands didn't shake. In the mirror, she saw herself clearly for the first time in a long time, elegant, composed, and completely changed. The harshest truth wasn't the offer itself. It was that Alden had known and still brought her into a house where the decision had already been made without her. Marbel folded the letter along its original crease with careful hands, if it deserved more respect than the people who wrote it. Outside the powder room, music continued to drift through the walls. Laughter, crystal glasses, life pretending nothing had shifted. But something had. She had spent years shrinking herself in rooms like these, softening her voice, adjusting her opinions, smiling through corrections, thanking people who never fully acknowledged her place. She had mistaken endurance for grace. Grace was not the same as disappearing. When she returned to the dining room, every candle still burned, as if nothing had changed. Alden rose slightly when she approached, his smile still carefully in place. "You Dr. Carter Tartar of Cardry." His smile still carefully in place. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked. Marbel placed the folded letter beside her plate, not dramatic, not loud, just visible enough for him to understand. The color drained from his face. Vivian froze mid-movement. Conrad's expression tightened, though the conversation around them continued, unaware something had just cracked open. Marbel sat down again and lifted her glass as the senator spoke about tradition and responsibility, and how families like the Pierces carried the future. Conrad agreed smoothly, saying bloodlines were obligation, not just biology. That was when Marbel set her glass down. Sound was soft, but it landed like a break in the room. She turned toward Conrad with steady calm. "What happens, Mr. Pierce?" she asked, "when a family protects its name by stripping someone else of dignity?" The table went quiet. Vivian's smile froze in place. The serenity, the stopped warble. Conrad looked at her like she had violated something unspoken that people like him expected everyone else to already obey. Alden whispered her name, low and urgent. She didn't look at him. Conrad answered that legacy required difficult decisions. Marbel nodded once, then she looked at Alden. "Silence," she said without speaking it, "is also a decision." The room stayed still. Even the candle flames seemed uncertain in the draft from the old windows. Alden tried to speak, but whatever apology he had stayed trapped halfway out. Marbel stood, without anyone noticing. She removed the diamond ring from her finger beneath the table. No cameras, no audience. Just a quiet ending. She placed it into Vivian's teacup. The porcelain clicked softly against the diamond. Vivian inhaled sharp. Marbel picked up the folded letter and held Alden's gaze for one last moment. "I was never your secret to keep," she said. Then she turned and walked out, past the portraits, past the carved doors, past every polished wall that had asked her to be smaller. She didn't stop until the music behind her faded completely. The marble hallway ahead looked beautiful in a way that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like something built for someone else's life. A young attendant started toward her, but she only nodded once and asked for her coat. Her voice didn't break. It didn't shake. It sounded like someone finally returning to herself. Outside, Charleston's night air met her face, salt, magnolia, and distant rain. Behind her, the estate glowed warm and golden, almost innocent from a distance. Some homes, she thought, only look like history from the outside. From within, they can feel like locked doors. Her phone lit up before the car reached the gate. Alden's name appeared once, then again. Watched the screen glow in her palm and didn't answer. There are conversations that should have happened long before a woman ever has to learn her own humiliation through a half-minus open door. And there are apologies that lose their meaning when they only arrive after everything has already been exposed. By midnight, Marbel was in a quiet hotel near King Street. She sat on the edge of a white bed, her shoes neatly placed beside her. A folded letter rested on the nightstand like proof that refused to soften. She hadn't taken anything from the Pierce estate, No jewelry, no photographs, no evening bag left behind in some polished room, only the letter. Not for revenge, but so she would never forget what dignity required her to remember. 2 in the morning, Alden arrived at the hotel lobby. The front desk called her room. His voice came through in the background, low at first, then breaking into something closer to desperation. He was asking to see his wife. Marbel stood at the window, watching streetlights stretch across wet pavement. For a moment, something like love passed through her memory. Uninvited, she saw Alden on a rainy Seattle morning, bringing coffee with too much cream because he never quite learned how she liked. She remembered his hand over hers at her mother's memorial. She remembered the quiet moments that once made her believe courage would eventually follow affection. But love is not always a reason to open a door. Sometimes it is the reason a woman learns to close it gently, before it teaches her how to disappear. She told the front desk she wasn't available. That night, she didn't see him. The next morning, before Charleston fully woke, Marbel bought a one-way ticket to Savannah, just over 100 miles away, close enough for memory to reach her, far enough for breath to return. On the train, she sat by the window as Live Oaks and Marshland drifted past in pale morning light. Her phone held 12 missed calls, 7 messages, and 1 voicemail she didn't listen to. One by one, she removed the names tied to the Pierce family, not in anger, but with steady precision. Brad Pierce, Vivian Pierce, Pierce Estate. Then, after a pause, Alden. When the train crossed into Georgia, she touched the empty space on her finger. A faint circle remained where the ring had been, like a memory the skin hadn't forgotten. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her hand around nothing and let the morning carry her forward. Savannah met her with a gray sky and streets that smelled of rain, river water, and warm brick. She didn't arrive like someone starting over. She arrived like someone carrying what was left of an entire life in a single bag. A folded letter, a pair of flats, a phone full of unanswered calls, and a heart that no longer expected every ending to be witnessed. First week, she rented a small upstairs room above a closed flower shop near East Bay Street. The floor creaked at night. One corner of the mirror was cracked. The window faced an alley where delivery trucks came before dawn. It wasn't beautiful like the Pierce estate. It didn't try to be. But for the first time in years, nothing in that space asked her permission to exist. Morning, she walked along the river before the city fully woke. Cargo ships passed slowly through the water, names painted in white across steel. They didn't apologize for leaving. They simply followed the time. By the second month, she found work with a small nonprofit documenting historic properties in overlooked neighborhoods. The office sat inside an old warehouse with exposed beams, dusty windows, and a coffee machine that sounded like it was giving up every time it brewed. Hay was modest. The furniture uneven, the air conditioning unreliable, but the work mattered. She listened to stories no one had tried to preserve properly. Families who built homes with their own hands. Churches raised without recognition. Shops that survived on memory more than money. She began to understand something simple and steady. History wasn't only preserved in grand estates. Sometimes it lived in front porches, handwritten recipes, worn church fans, and the careful hands of people who were never invited into the official record. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, then suddenly became clear. She wouldn't spend her life trying to be included in someone else's framed history. She would build spaces where forgotten names could be spoken again. Her remaining savings, she rented the back of the warehouse, set up second-hand drafting tables, and painted the door a deep blue. She called it Ellison House, after her mother's maiden name, the only inheritance no one could take away. At first, there were only a few clients, a couple of volunteers, and a stack of unpaid bills tucked under paperwork. She worked late into the night writing proposals, restoring records, and helping families protect their homes from quiet displacement. Some nights exhaustion sat beside her like another shadow. Still, she didn't stop. Pain had taught her what breaking felt like. Purpose taught her what to do with it. By the end of the first year, Ellison House had saved 6 properties. By the second, it had become known in community meetings far beyond Savannah. By the third, journalists were calling Marbel a rising voice in preservation. She never corrected them. She didn't see it that way. She hadn't risen to prove anyone wrong. Had simply refused to stay where she was placed. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the invitation arrived. A cream envelope, her name pressed into it in deep blue ink. She almost missed it under a pile of reports until her assistant mentioned Charleston with a careful tone that needed no explanation. Marbel already knew before she opened it. Some cities don't let go. They wait. The auction was for the Regal Star Theater, a forgotten landmark near the Charleston harbor, built in each endued centerbar by black craftsmen whose names never made it onto the cornerstone. For decades, it had held choirs, school plays, and community gatherings. Pageants, jazz quartets, Sunday lectures, and first dates once lived beneath velvet curtains softened by salt air. But over time, investors began circling the place like weather moving in. The Pierce Heritage Foundation wanted it. Their plan was to restore it and rename it after Conrad's grandfather. When Marbel read that line, she didn't feel anger. Anger would have been too loud, too simple for what moved through her. What she felt instead was quieter, older, and sharper in its own way. 3 weeks later, she returned to Charleston in a charcoal suit, low heels, and her mother's pearl earrings. The city looked almost unchanged. Horse carriages still moved past pastel houses. Church bells still drifted over cobblestone street. Live oaks still hung heavy with moss-like gray lace. But Marbel was no longer the same woman who had left with a pale circle on her finger. She arrived with board members, legal counsel, and a foundation strong enough to make powerful men sit straighter. The auction was held inside the theater itself. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon light spilling from cracked windows. Rows of worn red seats faced a stage where a faded velvet curtain still hung. Tired but proud, as if waiting for someone who remembered its name. Wealth filled the room in tailored suits and quiet confidence, but underneath it all, Marbel felt something else. The building wasn't empty, it was breathing. She thought of the hands that once built its balcony rails, the families who gathered here when other doors in the city stayed closed. The laughter, sermons, music, applause. This wasn't property. This was memory with a roof. Alden was already seated near the front when she arrived. For a moment, everything narrowed to the space between them. He looked older, quite like a man who had spent years sitting inside his own silence. Conrad sat rigid beside him. Vivian's pearls rested against her throat like armor that had never fully left her. Marbel didn't greet them, not from bitterness, but from completion. The bidding began at $4 million. It climbed quickly past 7. The Pierce Foundation raised its paddle with practiced certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere long ago. Marbel waited. She let the room reveal itself. Let confidence settle. Let old power believe it was still in control. Then, when the auctioneer called for the next bid, she lifted her paddle. $10 million. She said. Her voice was steady enough to make it sound inevitable. Silence spread through the theater. Conrad turned slowly, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as an inconvenience, not as a memory from his son's past, but as the person holding the outcome in her hands. Alden looked at her, and this time, he didn't look away. Final bid closed at $12.5 million in favor of Ellison House. The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the old theater like a final bell. Applause began politely, then grew stronger, row by row, until it filled the space and rose into the broken ceiling like something almost sacred. Marbel walked onto the stage. She placed her hand on the worn wood and felt no hesitation, no trembling. Years ago, she had left this city carrying proof she wasn't wanted. Now she had returned carrying something no one could take from her: a future. The applause hadn't fully faded when Alden stood. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was the quiet movement of someone realizing the chair beneath no longer matched who he had become. Conrad reached for him, gripping his sleeve in a silent command. Alden gently removed his father's hand. That small act shifted the room more than any announcement could. Vivian said his name under her breath, but he was already walking forward. Reporters lifted cameras. Phones rose. Marbel stayed still on the stage, one hand resting on the railing, watching him approach without reaction. Alden stopped a few steps away, close enough for history, far enough for honesty. Then he turned to the room. "My family came here today to preserve a version of history that served us," he said. Voice carried through the damaged hall. "But that isn't the full truth." Conrad rose sharply. "Years ago, my parents tried to remove Marbel Ellison from my life. They offered her money to disappear. They questioned her worth. They tried to decide who she was allowed to be to me." The room went still. Vivian lowered her gaze. Conrad muttered that this was unnecessary. Alden looked at him, and for the first time, the distance between father and son felt final. "No," Alden said quietly. "What was unnecessary was my silence." The words landed harder than anything shouted could have. He turned back to the room. "I love my wife privately, but I failed her publicly. I let comfort become loyalty. I let inheritance matter more than integrity. And when she needed me to stand beside her, I stood behind fear instead." Something shifted in Marbel's expression. Not forgiveness, not yet. Recognition. A truth finally arriving, even if late. Alden faced her directly now. "I'm sorry, Marbel. Not because you finally became strong enough for people to respect you, because the world sees you now. I'm sorry because you were always worthy, even when I didn't have the courage to act like it. No one applauded. Some truths don't ask for applause. Conrad walked out first. His footsteps sharp with control breaking. Vivian followed, fingers brushing her pearls, eyes fixed forward. Alden didn't follow. He stayed under the fractured ceiling, under the weight of cameras, under everything he no longer hid behind. Marbel looked at him. Then she said softly, "Thank you for telling the truth. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a return. It was acknowledged." 3 months later, the theater reopened. The name above it had changed, Ellison Hall. Marbel chose it for more than herself, for her mother, for her grandmother, for everyone whose work had been invisible but essential. Inside, the restored space smelled of wood, paint, and fresh flowers. A children's choir waited nervously near the stage. Elderly residents ran their hands along the walls like they were greeting something long missed. Alden arrived before the ceremony. No family, no cameras, no protection of status, just himself. He met Marbel near the aisle where sunlight cut through the windows in soft squares. Neither of them spoke at first. The distance between them no longer felt like pain. It felt like time that had taught its lesson. He looked up at the sign. "It fits," he said. "It fits the truth," she replied. After a pause, he asked, careful and sincere, "Is there any part of your heart that could begin again with me?" The question was gentle enough to accept. No. Marbel looked at him for a long moment. Brings. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't holding on either. "I forgive you, Alden," she said. "But forgiveness isn't the same as coming back." Understanding settled in his eyes, and for once he didn't ask her to be smaller so he could feel less lost. When the choir began to sing, Marbel stepped onto the stage alone. The applause that followed wasn't for a wife returned or a name restored by wealth. It was for a woman who had refused to disappear. Standing under the lights of Ellison Hall, she understood something simple and steady. Love should never require silence, and dignity, once claimed, does not turn around. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have cost her herself.